Hi everyone, how you doing? I hope you've had a really good day today and you are now ready for Nana's story. It's very exciting. It's called Fiddle-de-Dee's Spell and it's from Stories of Magic and Mischief. Ooh. So if you're sitting comfortably, then Nana will begin. Fiddle-de-Dee and Twinkles both went to the same brownie school. They were the greatest of friends and they always played games together and sat next to each other when they were in class. But one day they quarrelled. It was a dreadful quarrel and they both called each other some very rude brownie names. And it was all because of an apple. Fiddle-de-Dee had bought a lovely apple to school for his mid-morning break and Twinkles had bought a big shiny bun. Each brownie liked the look of what the other had. Sort of the way that, isn't it? So they decided to share what they had bought between them. Twinkles was going to give Fiddle-de-Dee half of his bun and in return he would have half of Fiddle-de-Dee's apple. So at 11 o'clock when their teacher sent all the brownies out to play, Twinkles cut his big shiny bun exactly in half and the two ate it. It was absolutely delicious. Then Fiddle-de-Dee took out a knife and sliced his apple in half. One half he gave to Twinkles and the other half he kept to himself. But when Twinkles bit into his half, what should he find but a large grub? And he could not eat any of his piece at all. Fiddle-de-Dee saw the grub too, and he quickly crammed all his piece of apple into his mouth before Twinkles had a chance to ask him for a bit. "That's not fair," cried Twinkles in a rage. "I gave you half my bun and it was all perfectly good, and now you've gobbled up the good half of your apple without even offering me a small piece of it. I say that you're mean, greedy brownie, Fiddle-de-Dee." Then they began to have a very big quarrel indeed. And all the other brownies came round and listened in surprise, for everyone knew what good friends the two brownies usually were. Twinkles knew far more horrible names than Fiddle-de-Dee knew, and Fiddle-de-Dee got crosser and crosser. And at last he clapped his hands twice and shouted, "If you say any more, I'll put a nasty spell on you." "You don't know any, you poor twisted toad little tiddlywinks," shouted back Twinkles. "Oh yes, I do," shouted Fiddle-de-Dee, "and I know an excellent spell for stupid people with hardly any brains like you. I can use a spell to make your silly little head half as small as it already is. Then what will you look like? Everyone will point their finger and laugh at you. Ho, ho, that really would be a fine spell to put on you, Twinkles." Twinkles began to feel uncomfortable. Fiddle-de-Dee looked so fierce. Just suppose he really did know a spell like that. What a dreadful thing it would be to go home with his head half as small again. Whatever would his mother say? Just then school bell rang to let all the brownies know it was time to go back into their classroom again, and off they all ran. Twinkles felt upset and could hardly do any work. He sat and moped, sometimes looking at Fiddle-de-Dee, who made dreadful faces at him whenever he could. After school was over, Twinkles rushed to the cloakroom before anyone else. He didn't want to wait for Fiddle-de-Dee. He really did feel quite frightened of him. He snatched down a hat from his peg, crammed it on his head, and ran off home. After he'd run a little way, he felt out of breath, so he slowed down. His hat fell forward onto his nose with a plop. Twinkles pushed it back impatiently. It slid forward again, right over his eyes, so that he couldn't see. Two pixies were passing and began to laugh. They pointed their finger at Twinkles and shouted, "Grow a larger head, little brownie, grow a larger head. Then your hat might just manage to stay on it." When he heard the pixies shout, Twinkles grew pale. Grow a larger head? Oh, goodness gracious! Was his head growing smaller? Had Fiddle-de-Dee put a horrible spell on him after all? His hat slid forward once again and rested on his nose. "He's made my head small just like he said he would," wailed poor little Twinkles in despair. "Oh, what a terrible sight I shall look! What will my mother say? How can I go to school this afternoon? Everyone will point their finger and laugh at me." Crying loudly, he ran home, and his mother was astonished to see the little brownie son come indoors with his hat on his nose and his mouth wide open, crying for all he was worth. In a minute or two, Twinkles told her all that had happened. His mother was very angry indeed. She took Twinkle's hand and marched him off to Fiddle-de-Dee's home. Fiddle-de-Dee was just going in at his gate. He turned round when he saw Twinkles and his mother. When he saw how angry Mrs. Twinkles looked, he was frightened and ran indoors and hid. Into the house marched Twinkle's mother, dragging her brownie son by the hand, for he could not see to walk with his hat on his nose. Fiddle-de-Dee's mother came to see what was the matter, and they started and stared at Twinkles in amazement. "Where is that wicked son of yours?" cried Twinkle's mother. "See what he's done to my poor little boy. He has put a spell on him to make his head small, and now his hat slips down to his nose all the time." But surely Fiddle-de-Dee wouldn't do a thing like that," said Mrs. Fiddle-de-Dee in surprise. "They are such great friends. Fiddle-de-Dee, Fiddle-de-Dee, where are you?" Fiddle-de-Dee crept out from under the table. He was very frightened. His mother took hold of him and asked, "Is this true, that you have put a spell on your friend Twinkles to make his head grow small?" "No, oh no," said Fiddle-de-Dee, beginning to cry. "I don't know a spell like that. I only said I did, just to frighten Twinkles. I don't know why his head's gone small. Indeed I don't. We did quarrel this morning, but I wouldn't really hurt him for anything in the world." Mrs. Fiddle-de-Dee took off Twinkle's hat to have a look at his head. She looked at it and looked at it, and then she turned to Mrs. Twinkles. "His head doesn't really seem any smaller to me," she said. "It seems about the same size as usual." Mrs. Twinkles looked at her brownie son's head, and then she looked again. "You're right," she said. "It really doesn't look any smaller than it was. How odd. How is it that his hat is slipping down over his nose then, and doesn't fit him as it usually does? That is certainly very strange." Then Fiddle-de-Dee came forward, and suddenly an idea in his mind, he picked up the hat which had been put down on the table, and he took a look inside it. Then he gave a shout. "Look," he said, "Twinkles has got the wrong hat. This hat belongs to Hey-Ho Brownie, whose head is the biggest in the whole school. It wouldn't fit anyone else at all, and it isn't any wonder it kept slipping down on Twinkle's nose. Oh dear, how very funny." Twinkle stared at Fiddle-de-Dee. So his head hadn't gone small after all. It was only that he'd taken the wrong hat, one that was much, much too large for him. Mrs. Twinkle looked at Mrs. Fiddle-de-Dee, and they both began to smile. And before anyone could say another word, all four brownies burst out laughing, holding their sides and rolling around the room, chuckling and giggling for all they were worth. Well, of course, you have to be friends when you all laugh together like that. And when they had finished, Twinkles and Fiddle-de-Dee hugged one another, and Mrs. Twinkles and Mrs. Fiddle-de-Dee kissed each other on the cheek. Then, still smiling, they said goodbye, and Twinkles and his mother went happily off to lunch. And that was the end of the quarrel, except that Hey-Ho Brownie was very angry indeed with Twinkles for taking his hat home by mistake. "What do you suppose I look like with your silly little hat perched on top of my head?" he shouted at Twinkles that afternoon. "I've a good mind to punish you." But Fiddle-de-Dee came to Twinkle's help. "You leave my friend Twinkles alone," he said, and he looked so fierce that Hey-Ho Brownie crept away, feeling rather frightened. "So it's nice to be friends again," said Twinkles happily. "Don't let's ever quarrel again, Fiddle-de-Dee." And you know what? They never did. Oh, I like that story. What a funny story. He really thought his head had shrunk, didn't he? Ooh. Anyway, so I hope you enjoyed that. So sleep well. I love you loads and loads, and I will see you again tomorrow. So night-night, Ruby. Night-night, Max. Night-night, Atty. Night-night, Torben. I love you all so much, and you be really good, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.